Thank you. So, 1936. It's a big blowout. What's to see here? I mean, maybe we should just skip forward to Pearl Harbor. Okay? Nothing's going on here. Nothing to see except one thing. The shorthand history is the polls got it wrong. The Literary Digest said that Alf Landon was going to carry 31 states, and spoiler alert, he didn't come close. But what is the story, and why was it so wrong? Why people got it wrong? Why it didn't have to be the Roosevelt blowout or even a Roosevelt win in 1936? Because there's a Roosevelt scholar named Ellis Hawley, and he says that here is his description of conditions that year. Over 10.5 million workers were still unemployed. Approximately 20 million people were still dependent on relief. Basic industry still ran at little more than half capacity. And the real income of the average family remained 13% below that of 1929. So it's not exactly a robust economy. In November 1936, the unemployment rate is 13.9%. This is not a formula for re-election normally. Of course, it's not normal times because things had been so much worse leading up to Roosevelt taking power in March 1933. What happens that year, from March until July, there is this amazingly robust economy. Manufacturing rises 78%, the Dow Jones average up 71%, manufacturing production 78%, durable goods production 199%, auto production rises from 97,000 units to 191,000, daily steel production from 33 tons to 116 tons, and the workforce goes up to 5 to 6 million. The average work week rises 32.1 hours to 42.9. This is a great recovery, but it all goes back down in the next few months. So what's going to happen in those 1934 midterms? Because what always happens in midterms is the party in power loses steam. They lose votes or seats in Congress, in the Senate, in the House. And also, what's the mood? What's the history of the country? What is the allegiance of the country? Well, we know that people aren't singing Brother, Can You Spare a Dime as much as it was. They're singing Happy Days Are Here Again to a greater extent. But in 1932, the number of registered Republicans in the country, with Roosevelt beating the tar out of Hoover, is 59%. The country is still 59% Republican. And in 1934, it's the 52%. And what do the Democrats do? They pick up seats in the House of Representatives, and they pick up seats in the Senate. So things are looking good for Roosevelt in 1934. That Literary Digest, which has the famously bad prediction of the 1936 election, says in 1934, they ask a question of their readers, and it goes like this: how do you support the New Deal or not? And it's about like 62% of their people come back, and that's about the same percentage that votes Democrat for the House of Representatives in 1934. So their figures are still pretty darn good. And they've been historically good, since they started doing it. In 1916, they get everything right. It's a real eyelash election, and they get everything right. They get every state right in 1924, except Kentucky. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt's old boss, Josephus Daniels, who runs a newspaper in North Carolina, and full disclosure, I used to work for the Daniels family, but not Josephus. I haven't been around that long. Says, we might as well cancel this election in 1932. We'll just buy a copy of the Literary Digest, and we'll know how it's going to turn out. So in 1934, going into the 1936 election, all of a sudden the amount of people saying they approve of the New Deal goes down to just a bare majority. It's on the bubble. They've still got the majority, but it's on the bubble. And what happens when your popular vote is on the bubble? Well, maybe the Electoral College is not going to go that way. We've seen that twice in recent years. So the same thing could happen in 1936. Now, Roosevelt has also had a couple of setbacks going into that year with the Supreme Court. He's had two of his big programs. We're sitting here in the Henry Wallace Center. Henry Wallace was involved in agricultural policy for the New Deal. He was Secretary of Agriculture. Roosevelt's policy or program to deal with agriculture was to create shortages, scarcity, drive up farm prices. Not a bad political move because 25% of the population is still farmers. Big voting bloc. They know where their bread is buttered. But that gets knocked out by the Supreme Court. The same thing happens with his National Recovery Administration, which was basically a cartelization of industry, where industry writes codes for what you can do. The famous Schechter case in Brooklyn, where the code said you are not going to be able to pick out a chicken, a live chicken from the Schechter brothers, and they allow a woman to do this, and the feds come down on them. And the Schechter case says, the hell with it. We've had enough of this overregulation, and so these two big cornerstones of the New Deal are knocked out going into 1936. Another pollster who is going to get it right, and not all the pollsters get it wrong, and it's not just the Literary Digest that gets it wrong, but the Gallup poll comes into the forefront at this point. George Gallup had taught at Columbia, and he gets into all kinds of the major newspapers in the country. And every week you can see the results of how people are voting. At the beginning of 1936, he asked people, so if there were two parties in this country, not Democrat or Republican, but there were two parties and they were called conservative and liberal, which one would you belong to? And the majority of the people say conservative. So these are some of the factors which are facing Franklin Roosevelt as he goes into the 1936 election. The people around him, and even Franklin Roosevelt himself, now Roosevelt is not one of those naysayers. He's got the big smile, and whether he believes it or whether he believes something or not, he will convince you of something that he wants you to believe in. But so he's always saying, we're going to win, we're going to win, we're going to win. And I think he is a smart enough politician to correctly ascertain things, but there are other people worried about what the results in the Electoral College could be. And they are worried about states like, as late as September 1936, they are worried about the results in the state of Illinois. He has to do a big campaign swing and get the vote out in Chicago so as not to lose that state. He's worried about the state of Michigan. There's opposition there in the form of Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, who had been a big supporter of his, but now has turned on him with a vengeance. And he's worried about another state, which was begins in N and ends in K, New York. of all states, New York, which sounds crazy, because even in 1930, when he's running for re-election as governor of New York, he carries the state by 1 million votes. So what's the problem in New York? Well, part of it is a bit of a problem in the whole country. I used to do baseball history when I was working for the Daniels family. And there's in baseball history and statistics, sabermetrics, a thing called the plexiglass principle. And so if someone's hit 193 and 205 in their career, and all of a sudden they hit 305, well, maybe next year they're going to go back to 230 or something. And maybe the Democrats been riding so high and it's time to come back down to earth. And particularly to come back down to earth in New York State, because one of the forces of opposition to the New Deal comes from the old Socialist Party, which is centered in New York State. They had polled 400,000 votes in New York State or in New York City for mayor a year or two before. So if they carry only half of that statewide in 1936, you could see a problem in New York State again. And how worried are they about this? They are so worried that at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia that year, where things are going pretty well, actually they're going terrific. There's no division in the party at that convention like in subsequent years, like in 1948 or anything like that. All the votes are voice votes. There's really no dissent. But Franklin Roosevelt has to butter up his successor as governor of New York, Herbert Lehman, to get him to run again, because he's hoping that the Lehman coattails will help carry the electoral votes in New York State. This all sounds so far-fetched to us today, knowing how the movie ends, but was not what was in their mind at that point. Now, one of the things which surprised me in doing the book is how reactive Franklin Roosevelt could be. Again, we know how the movie ends. We know there's 100 days. We know he has all these programs, many of which would be in place today. But there are some things he wants to do from the start. He wants to do the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, from the start. Franklin Roosevelt likes trees. There were a lot of trees he was growing here. This was his business, okay? And he loved conservation. And, the CCC was a good plan. Got people out there working. They got a check. They sent it home. They built trails and dams and cleared things out. Prevented erosion and floods. So it was a good thing. Eleanor did not think it was, by the way. Eleanor thought it was a really lousy idea, that it wasn't accomplishing anything, but the rest of the country did. 70-some% of Republicans thought it was a good idea. So he wanted to do that, and he wanted to do the TVA, because he, like Al Smith, were big public policy advocates. So you didn't have to drag him in to do that. But he's reactive in a lot of ways. So he's got this guy opposed to him. He has a lot of opposition in the Democratic Party. People who had supported him in 1932. He has Al Smith opposing him, and that's from the right, and the Liberty League with a bunch of millionaires from the DuPont family and DuPont Industries and General Motors. General Motors was built with DuPont money, and they were fabulously wealthy, and they did not like Franklin Roosevelt by 1936. But they also had left-wing opposition in the Democratic Party coming from Huey Long. Huey Long has a Soak the Rich program. He doesn't get to run against Roosevelt in 36. He wanted to, but he shot in September 1935. His Soak the Rich program is met by Franklin Roosevelt with a new tax program which basically socks it to everyone making $1 million or more in the country. And it's sort of a PR move on Roosevelt's part, because it's not gonna, it just doesn't produce any revenue. But it's like, yeah, we'll get those rich guys. He also reacts to a guy very much unlike Long, because Long was so flamboyant and so eloquent, but a country doctor named Francis Townsend out in California, who writes a letter to the editor about how we should have a plan, the Townsend plan, to give $200 a month to all the old folks in the country, and as long as they don't work and they spend the money within 30 days, and this will stimulate the economy, sort of pump priming. But Roosevelt hates this plan. It's financially stinko, quite frankly. It's going to be funded by a use tax. So say you have like a pencil, and so you get the wood, and they take government taxes 2% on the wood, and then you paint the wood. There's another 2%, and then you have an eraser on it. There's another 2%, and then maybe you sharpen it, and then you sell the damn thing, etc., etc. So you would have this massive, something akin to a sales tax. Roosevelt hates it, and he is so opposed to that, but he's also opposed to doing Social Security early on. Harry Hopkins gives a speech in New York one day and says, this is the time for Social Security, for old age pensions. And the very next day, from the very same platform, Roosevelt cuts the legs out from under him and says, no, this is not the time, because I want to do unemployment insurance at this point. But then hundreds of thousands of people sign up for these Townsend clubs, and they start electing people to Congress, and they put forward the Townsend plan before Congress, and guess what happens the next day? The next day, Franklin Roosevelt puts Social Security into Congress, and then it passes very quickly. Now, the Townsend people, the Long people, are going to join up with a guy named Lemke, who is a congressman from North Dakota, who is dissatisfied with Roosevelt's agricultural policy, and with Long's successor, a really nasty guy called Gerald L.K. Smith, a former minister, and like Coughlin, a pretty severe anti-Semite, are going to try and form a third party to punish Roosevelt in 1936. Without Long at the helm, it's going to score less than 2% of the vote. These guys are amateurs, they don't know what to do, and frankly, Bill Lemke is not Huey Long. So it doesn't really go into anything substantially that way, but it has, until Long is shot, the potential of really derailing Long. And what's Long's plan? Is it to be elected president in 1936? No. Huey Long is a crazy, ambitious guy, but he's not crazy and he's not dumb. And his plan was, again, to fool around with the Electoral College and to throw the votes to the Republicans. Now, I'm not going to really talk about the Republicans here because, frankly, they're the dullest part of the entire story. You know, Alf Landon, not happening. But the guy in back of Alf Landon, and the Republicans don't have much to choose from, is William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst, so many of these people you see had backed Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. Smith, Long, Lemke, Al Smith, all of these people, and so had Hearst. Hearst had put him in with the nomination at the Democratic National Convention. But with, you know, we talk about Murdoch or people like that having a media empire. Hearst is really the first guy to be Mr. Multimedia. He has a huge amount of daily papers in all the big cities. He has what, 3 papers in New York City? 3. He has 25% of all the Sunday circulation in the country, and he has newsreels, and he has a motion picture studio, and he has magazines. To this day, they have Cosmopolitan, the Hearst thing. But Hearst is going to turn on Roosevelt. Roosevelt has to deal with the lack of support in the press. It's not as dire as he says. Actually, he has the greatest support, or the Republicans have the least amount of support in 36 of any of his 4 runs. But he runs. Roosevelt is such a smart politician that he's able to channel and market the opposition he gets from people like Hearst, who is by now very, very unpopular, and the Liberty League, who are, like I said, really rich guys, and to run against them, to turn a negative into a positive in that campaign, and to tar the Republicans with that brush, that these are the people that are being backed by, backing the Democrats. Now, in the, Roosevelt has, of course, put a lot of people to work on the government payroll. There are a lot of people on relief. And as they say, you can't shoot Santa Claus. So 78%, this is another Gallup poll, 78% of people on relief, oddly enough, are going to vote for Roosevelt. That's a big, big voting bloc. So things are moving along. We come to the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia. Again, no opposition to Roosevelt there, but it's still a very significant convention in a bunch of ways. And one is, I'm not going to get into the black vote in this talk because you've got Jill Watts. You can listen to her at the end of this program, and I recommend that you hang around for that. She does great work. This is the first time that they have had black delegates in the Democratic National Convention. Republicans have had it since, well, forever, really, probably since the 14th Amendment, but not the Democrats. And they have 12 delegates, and they have 22 alternates, and this creates a tension in the party. You have a senator from South Carolina, Cotton Ed Smith. He walks out, not because there are delegates there, which cheeses him off enough, but when you have a black minister give the invocation one day. So this is the beginning of the split, really, within the Democratic Party on race, even though Franklin Roosevelt is going to be very approaching gingerly on this. More significantly is the 2/3 rule is abolished. The Democrats had a whole bunch of deadlocks in their history because you needed 2/3 of the delegates to move ahead, to get anyone nominated. And so you end up with 103 ballots in 1924. They eliminate that. The stranglehold or the veto power of the South in the Democratic Party is really hit by this. And also you see rumors that year of maybe Franklin Roosevelt's going to run for a 3rd term. And Jim Farley, the boss of the Democratic National Convention, says, no, that's absurd. Not going to happen. But of course it does happen. There is rumbling from the press that maybe the Democrats are in trouble, even at this point. And this is the talk where the convention where Rendezvous with Destiny comes from. And this was by a guy named Tommy Corcoran, a young speechwriter. The other speechwriters, the grandson of Sam Rosenman, who was Roosevelt's favored speechwriter, and he had a ton of them. Franklin Roosevelt was like MGM with a staff of script writers, okay? He had the writers, and then he was the star. He transformed it. But he had this stable of writers, and his main one was Sam Rosenman, who was a New York State Supreme Court justice. And I'm going to ask you a question now. His one of his granddaughters is married to who? Time's up. Merrick Garland. Okay? Yeah. I never see this in the press. Nobody cares about history, damn it. This is history. So, but Tommy writes economic rendezvous with destiny. And they don't want him to use it because they think it's going to sound like rendezvous with dentistry. And they says, no, you should do this. Then they come back and say, no, it's going to sound like that poem that Pete Seeger's uncle wrote in World War I, Rendezvous with Death. And they go ahead with it. They use it. It's a big hit. Things are still, by July 12, Gallup is predicting Landon's going to take the Electoral College 272 to 259. And Emil Herja, the press secretary, or the pollster for the Democrats, is predicting trouble all the way. And Charlie Michelson, who was a big PR guy for the Democratic National Committee, says Roosevelt, or the House, they're going to lose 100 seats in the House, the Democrats. So trouble is brewing, but it never quite gets there. Fast forward ahead to the results. You know, it's 46 states to 2 for Roosevelt. There's a historic shift in the black vote. 71% of blacks, and the blacks had gone for Hoover in 1932 and historically had been a GOP bastion. And you see that the Catholics are for Roosevelt. The Jewish vote is 90% for Roosevelt. 104 of the 106 largest cities in the country are Democratic now for Roosevelt. The Republican Party is essentially wiped out as an urban force. So it's all Roosevelt all the time. But be careful, don't fly too high, and he flies too high in 1938, and there are reverses. But basically, he's on his rendezvous with destiny. So now, questions, if you would. Oh, there's no microphone here, so yes, I will repeat the question.
Without going into any detail, because you mentioned it, Al Landon seems today like something of a joke. Was he at the time, or was he a pretty serious candidate?
The question is, how serious a candidate was Landon? It was a very well-funded campaign. He was backed by Hearst, which they were, praising him to the skies. He had won in 2 very bad years for the GOP. He was a progressive Republican, so it wasn't like he was Mr. Reaction, but he was a terrible speaker. And he kept sticking. So he doesn't go to the convention. Then what's he do after the convention? He goes on vacation to a very wealthy resort in Colorado. Now, this is something very interesting, a digression, because I specialize in digressions. I don't give talks, I don't write books, I just write massive digressions. And what happens is that Roosevelt also goes on vacation after his convention. It was very different then. And Roosevelt gives no fireside chats from April 1935 to September 1936. Okay? And part of the reason for that is he told Ray Stannard Baker, who was an old Wilson guy, Woodrow Wilson, in March, he says this, right before he stops giving fireside chats. Coincidence. He says the public psychology, and for that matter, individual psychology, cannot, because of human weakness, be attuned for long periods of time to a constant repetition of the highest note on the scale. People tire of seeing the same name day after day in the important headlines of the papers and the same voice night after night over the radio. I won't say this is a hint to anyone running for president, but it could be. So anyway, Landon gives a series of speeches on the tariff and farm policy, which are disasters, and then in Milwaukee, towards the end of the campaign, he touches the third rail of American politics, which is already there, Social Security. And he alienates everyone, the people who were concerned about Social Security and the people who liked it. And he loses a ton of votes just on that. So he is not a good candidate, and he has a terrible delivery. You read over and over again in the diaries and journals of people who are listening to him on their radio, and they're just like, we cannot believe how bad this guy is. So yeah, kind of not a unprincipled politician. Oh, he wins in a fluke though in 1932. It's a three-way race, and it ends up not like the usual three-way races. It's like 34, 32, 31. And the third-party guy is called a guy named Dr. Brinkley, who had a big radio station out of Kansas that covered the whole middle of the country. And he was called the goat gland doctor. And he would give men goat glands. I won't say why. Okay, but this is how Alf Landon became governor of Kansas. And not only does Landon go down, but his protege, his secretary, was supposed to be elected as governor of Kansas. And he gets bombed out too. So essentially the party moves on from him. Yes, next question.
Hearst had a confidential meeting with Hitler in Berlin.
Yes.
In, I think, 34. There were rumors that he had sold his news service to the German propaganda.
Well, he had been getting some sort of a subsidy. It didn't appear to be true. And the New York Times, this was interesting, the New York Times printed an article to this effect one day. And then it was like, we're not sure we can prove this. We're not sure this is true. And they went around and got, they used to have all these different editions of newspapers, and they went and collected them all up and burned them. It wasn't just book burning, it was newspaper burning. So yeah, but that was a very controversial situation. The head of the Scripps chain, I think Roy Howard, went and met with Hitler and then met with Stalin, and with no repercussions. I think he won a Pulitzer Prize for his interview with Stalin. But yeah, Hearst was by that point poisoned for a bunch of reasons. His anti-communism, his investigations into radicalism on the college campuses, and just people had always not liked him anyway. I think the Republicans had never liked him. He was too radical. And then when he turns on Roosevelt, then the Democrats didn't like him either. The irony is that, he's about ready to go bust. His finances are shaky because he spends too much money. And when World War II is about ready to start, they're selling off everything, and he has to get loans from his mistress and all that. But the New Deal and the war sort of saves him. Yes?
How does turnout compare to 1932, and was that a factor?
Whoa, turnout. Yeah, here's a great point. From 1920, this is not so much about raw turnout. Well, I think the numbers are going up all the time. And from 1920 through 1932, the Republican vote is totally flat. I don't mean as a percentage. Okay, the percentage goes up and down. But the raw number is completely flat. Okay? But the Democratic vote, with the exception of 28, is up, 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 up. So Landon gets more votes like in Kansas, I think overall, and in Pennsylvania specifically than Hoover does. And he gets buried. He gets buried worse than Hoover because that Democratic vote keeps going up, whereas the Republicans are not moving at all. In 1910, and some sort of sociologist said, hey, you know, all that immigration, all those people coming in at Ellis Island for the last 10 years, and they keep coming and coming and coming. You watch in 25 years when their kids grow up and start voting. That takes you to about 1936, and you're going to see this massive change. And that's exactly what happens that year. So it's not just the children of the immigrants, but a very good election analyst of stuff today, a guy named Sean Trent. He reported in one of his books and said that with the black vote, that the older blacks remained Republican in 36. But the new generation, this was in large part a generational thing. And so the Roosevelt had captured all those guys in the CCC camps and the guys who were thrown out of work when they left high school in one form or another and couldn't find a job, and he put them to work in some way, or that they were at least, you know, it was the statement that this is the president we always knew. And even in 1936, he was the guy you knew and trusted for the younger people. Yes, anyone else? Yes.
You mentioned something about,
I keep forgetting to repeat the questions. Are you people, can you people hear it? I'll try to repeat this one.
you mentioned something about an association of millionaires.
Yeah.
And I didn't catch who they were and what
Okay.
side they were on.
Okay, so the question is an association of millionaires, and whose side were they on, and who were they? It's called the Liberty League. It was the idea of a guy named John Jacob Raskow, who was a functionary, a big executive with DuPont and General Motors. He had been chairman of the Democratic National Committee in 1928 and was a big Al Smith fan. He gave Smith the job of being president, not of the United States, that didn't work in 1928, but president of the Empire State Building, which was then known as the Empty State Building because of the Depression. And they were fighting Roosevelt in 32, okay? They're conservatives. They're also wets. They're very much opposed to prohibition. And they had a big anti-prohibition organization, and a lot of those millionaires go into this Liberty League, which published a lot of brochures and position papers, but that's about it. Their membership wasn't that big. The significant thing about them is that in January 1936, they hold a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel, where Joe Biden was last night. And it's really, and that keynote speaker is Al Smith. And Smith, the optics is everything. So the reports are all of the DuPont. There are like a dozen DuPonts there. They're all multimillionaires. All these other people are rich. They're really living it up in the middle of the Depression. And Al Smith, the guy from the Fulton Fish Market, not only is there in a tuxedo, he's there in tails and a white tie, okay? He really does it. And he gives a talk about how you're going to have to choose between the red flag of Moscow and the stars and stripes. And the speech just bombs, okay? And again, that's Roosevelt gets to run against them, and he gets to run against Hearst as much as he runs against the Republicans. Roosevelt is careful about really not demonizing the Republicans so much, because remember, there's a big progressive wing of the Republicans. He endorses George Norris of Nebraska that year, and he brings 3 Republicans into his cabinet in 33. Henry Wallace, Wooden at Treasury, Harold Ickes at Interior. Harold Ickes replaced Bronson Cutting of New Mexico, who died in a plane crash earlier, another progressive Republican. And then he brings Henry Stimson into the cabinet, Secretary of War in World War II, and Frank Knox, which is a really interesting move because Frank Knox was Alf Landon's running mate in 36. So, and I think it's Rexford Tugwell says Roosevelt's game in 1936 was to realign the parties. Conservatives here, Democrats, progressives here. So he wants to get all those TR progressive guys into the Democratic Party. Is it time? It's time!